My name is Calvin Jarvis, though everyone in my family calls me Walt. I am 67 years old, and for 12 years, my daughter-in-law introduced me to her friends as the janitor, not as her father-in-law, not as Ryan's father, not as Walt. The janitor. I never corrected her. My family knows why. But last Thanksgiving, she went one step further. She looked me in the eye, right in front of my own grandchildren, and told me I did not belong at the table. That was the moment I decided 12 years of patience had been more than enough. Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to like and subscribe if you are new here. It really does help. And wherever you are watching from, drop your city and your local time in the comments. I always like knowing who is on the other end of this story. Now let me take you back to the fall of 2012, to the first Thanksgiving I sat at that table, and to the beginning of the last season, when I still allowed someone else to decide where I belonged. My wife Margaret used to say, "Walt, if you have to tell people you're important, you're not." I lived by that my whole life, maybe for too long. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, the kind of town where people still wave to strangers from their front porches. After Margaret passed away 8 years ago from cancer, I stayed in the same house we had shared for 31 years, same neighborhood, same Saturday mornings in the garden, same Ford F-150 I bought in 2009 and still have no intention of replacing. People see the flannel shirts, the work boots, and the old truck in the driveway, and they draw their own conclusions. I have never minded that. Margaret taught me that a man's worth is not something he wears on his sleeve. It is something built quietly over decades, in the choices nobody sees him make. My own choices started with one plot of land I bought when I was 31, a half-acre outside Columbus that most people thought was worthless. I thought differently. One property led to another, and over time, Jarvis Holdings LLC became the kind of company that does not need to advertise. Commercial real estate, property services, and a few subsidiary operations. Nothing flashy. Nothing that required me to change how I dressed, what I drove, or how I lived. The only person outside my attorney who understood the full picture was Patricia Nguyen, my executive assistant for 11 years. Pat kept the operation running while I kept the garden growing. That was the arrangement we had, and it worked. My son Ryan grew up watching me fix things with my hands, engines, fences, leaky pipes, anything that needed patience and a little stubbornness. He became an architect in Columbus, and I have always been proud of him for that. When he called to tell me he had met someone, I drove up to meet her with nothing but goodwill. I should tell you about that first meeting, because that is where this story really begins. Her name was Diane Marsh. She was sharp, polished, and knew how to fill a room. Ryan brought her to Millbrook in October of 2012, before their first Thanksgiving together, and I could see right away why my son had fallen for her. She had the kind of confidence that arrives before she does. I shook her hand at the door. She smiled the way people smile when they are making a first impression on someone they have already categorized. Her eyes moved past me to the living room, then to the driveway, where my F-150 was parked. Just for a second, then they came back to me. She told me Ryan talked about me all the time, and said it was nice to finally meet me. I told her the pleasure was mine, and I meant it. Over dinner, she asked what I did now that I was retired. The word retired landed gently, like she had chosen it carefully. I told her I still kept busy with a few property things. She nodded and moved on to other topics. I noticed she did not ask a second question. In her mind, the picture was already complete. Old man, small town, odd jobs. I did not correct her. Ryan had not shared the details of my business, and I had never encouraged him to. Our family did not talk about money at the table. That was Margaret's rule, and I kept it long after she was gone. Ryan married Diane the following spring. I paid for most of the wedding at my son's quiet request, with one condition: nobody mentions it. Diane never asked where the money came from. I noticed that too. At the reception, she handed me a glass of water and told me it was sweet that I still kept myself busy. I smiled and told her there was always something to do. Then, she moved on to her other guests. Thanksgiving of 2014 was when I first understood that Diane's assumption about me was not just private. By then, she had started hosting, and she had expanded the guest list to include people from her world. Couples with good careers, good addresses, and good opinions of themselves. That year, she brought in Brad and Leslie Whitmore. Brad was a real estate attorney. Leslie did something in marketing. They were the kind of people who asked about your square footage before they asked about your children. I arrived early, as I always did, with an apple pie I had made from scratch using Margaret's recipe, the one she had written on a card in her careful handwriting, the one I still kept folded inside my kitchen drawer. Diane took the pie at the door and set it on the counter without comment. When Brad and Leslie arrived, Diane moved through the room making introductions. She brought them to where I was standing near the window. She introduced me as Ryan's dad and said I used to do maintenance work around properties. Brad shook my hand and said it was good to meet me, but he was already looking past me before the words were finished. Later, I went to the kitchen to refill my coffee. Diane was at the counter with Leslie, speaking in a low voice. I heard her say I looked like the janitor. Then came a small laugh, then Leslie's quiet agreement. I stood there for a moment. Neither of them had heard me come in. I walked back outside onto the driveway and stood next to my truck. I drank my coffee and watched the bare November trees at the end of the street. The pie was still on the counter, not on the table. I did not tell Ryan that night. He had had 2 glasses of wine and was laughing with Brad about a football game. I did not want to be the thing that changed that. So I drove home and I filed it away. But that was not a one-time thing. I want to be clear about that. What Diane did in that kitchen in 2014 was not a slip. It was a policy she refined over the next 9 years. At Ryan's birthday dinner, when it was just the 4 of us at their house, I began telling the story of the summer Margaret and I spent driving through the Smokies, our first real vacation after Ryan started school. I was maybe 3 sentences in when Diane touched Ryan's arm and said we should probably move on because Dad tells long stories. Ryan laughed. I stopped talking. At Sophie's 5th birthday party, Diane's friends were in the backyard. She introduced me with a smile as Grandpa Walt, the man who did handyman stuff. Heads nodded around the group. Someone said I must be useful. At another Thanksgiving, the dining room table seated 12. There were 11 people in the house, including me. I sat at a folding table in the hallway. Ryan said the dining room was crowded. I counted the chairs twice. Another time, I was coming downstairs when I heard Diane in the kitchen talking to Ryan. The words came through the wall clearly. She said she did not want the children thinking that was what success looked like. Ryan said nothing. On Christmas morning, Diane suggested I give Mason a set of garage tools instead of money for his college fund. She said it was more appropriate for what I knew, meaning what she thought I knew. Through all of it, I never once thought to cross-reference her employer against my own companies. Why would I? Harmon Property Services was a subsidiary, 3 layers deep, run by its own CEO, with its own HR and payroll. I owned it the way you own a piece of a puzzle that is already assembled. I knew it was there, but I had not looked at every piece by name. Every Friday afternoon, I picked up Sophie and Mason from school. That was my standing arrangement with Ryan, in place since Sophie started kindergarten. Diane had no objection. I think she appreciated the childcare, even if she would never have said it that way. The kids and I would go back to my house in Millbrook and get into whatever project needed doing. I taught Sophie how to patch a bicycle inner tube. Mason and I spent 3 Fridays building a birdhouse from scrap lumber, which he painted yellow with blue spots because he believed birds liked those colors. I made grilled cheese sandwiches, and we watched whatever game was on. Most Fridays, Sophie fell asleep on the couch before her parents came to get her. One afternoon in early October, a few weeks before Thanksgiving, Sophie climbed up on the kitchen counter while I was washing dishes. She watched me the way children do when something is working itself out in their heads. Then she asked why her mother called me the janitor. I turned off the faucet. I dried my hands. I turned around. She was looking at me with those clear, serious eyes she gets from Ryan. I told her Diane was just telling a joke she did not understand yet. Sophie thought about that, then said it was not a very good joke. I told her no, it was not. I finished the dishes. But something shifted in me that afternoon. This was not just about me and Diane anymore. It had not been for a while. My grandchildren were watching. They were learning what respect looked like, or what it did not look like, and I was the one letting that lesson happen. The following Monday, I called Pat. I told her I wanted a full HR review of Harmon Property Services, specifically the controller level and above. I told her it was nothing urgent, just housekeeping. Pat called back the next morning. Diane Marsh Jarvis, controller, hired 3 years ago by CEO Marcus Brown, strong performance record. Marcus had been considering her for an interim CFO role. I was quiet for a moment. Then I thanked Pat. She asked if I needed anything else from the file. I told her no, but there was one more thing. I wanted my name current on all official filings before year end. Everything through Jarvis Holdings had to be clean and accurate. Pat said she would take care of it by Friday. That was all. I did not ask Pat to do anything to Diane's position. I did not call Marcus. I did not call Ryan. I was not building a case, and I was not planning some dramatic confrontation. What I was doing was simpler than that. I was stopping. Stopping the quiet arrangement I had kept for more than 30 years, where I stood in the back of my own life and let other people narrate it. Diane had worked for me for 3 years without knowing it. She had spent 12 years telling people I was the janitor while cashing a paycheck that, at the end of a long chain of subsidiary filings, had my name on it. I did not engineer that irony. It had arrived on its own. I just decided to stop being invisible. Thanksgiving was 6 weeks away. Then Diane sent an email with the subject line, "About Dad's seat this year." Ryan forwarded it to me with a note that said he wanted me to be in the loop and asked for my thoughts. Diane's proposal was written in the tone she used for everything, organized, reasonable sounding, designed so that objecting to it would make you look like the difficult one. The dining room table, she explained, seated 12 comfortably. This year, there would be 14 adults. To keep things from feeling crowded, she suggested a 2-table setup. The main dining room would be for Ryan's circle, and the covered porch would be for extended family. She would put Carol and me out there. She would make it cozy, she said. String lights, a space heater. I read it twice. The email was polite, organized, and airtight. Objecting to it would make me look like the problem. That was Diane's particular skill. She could arrange things so that any pushback looked like the issue, not the arrangement itself. Ryan called that evening. He said Diane was just trying to keep things organized and asked if I could work with it this year. I told him I would be there. He sounded relieved, the way he always did when a potential conflict dissolved. Ryan has always been good at hoping problems will resolve themselves. I understand it. He grew up watching me absorb things quietly, and he learned from what he saw. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Then I called Pat. I told her Thanksgiving was on the 28th, that I would be at Ryan's house in Columbus, and that I needed her there at 2:00 with the Fairfield documents. The other party's counsel had sent through a revised addendum that afternoon, and it needed my wet signature before the Monday closing. I told her to bring physical copies. There was a pause. Then she said she could drive up Thursday at 2:00. I gave her the address. She did not ask why I was not signing at the office before I left. The revision had come in that afternoon, too late for me to stay. Sometimes timing handles things on its own. Harmon Property Services occupied the 4th floor of a glass office building in Columbus's Short North District. 42 employees. A clean lobby with a company logo on the wall. Marcus Brown ran the day-to-day operations with the confidence of a man who had earned his position, which he had. Diane had her own office, a corner one on the north side, decorated with framed prints and a standing desk she had ordered on the company account. She was good at her job. Marcus had told me as much in our quarterly calls. The books were clean, the reporting was sharp, and she had built a team that respected her. She did not know that the company name on her office letterhead, Harmon Property Services, was a subsidiary of Harmon Holdings Group, which was itself a wholly owned entity under Jarvis Holdings LLC. The organizational chart stopped at Marcus for all practical purposes. HR, payroll, benefits, everything ran through Harmon's own systems. My name was in the state filings, but not in the employee handbook. I found out later from one of her colleagues that she mentioned the upcoming Thanksgiving to her team that week. She said Ryan's dad was coming and described me as old school, someone who did maintenance and odd jobs from that generation. Someone asked if I was a contractor. She said it was more like handyman stuff, then changed the subject. That same afternoon, 3 floors below the office where my daughter-in-law was describing me to her staff, I was in my home office in Millbrook, flannel shirt, coffee going cold on the desk. The Zoom call was a board-level review of the Fairfield acquisition, a commercial property deal worth just under $4 million. On the screen was my name, Calvin Jarvis, Chairman, Jarvis Holdings LLC. Diane had no idea. For a few more weeks, neither did anyone else who mattered to her. I drove out to see my sister Carol the weekend before Thanksgiving. She lives 10 minutes from me in Millbrook, in the house she and her husband Gerald bought 40 years ago. Carol is 70, and she has the particular quality older sisters seem to have everywhere. She sees through things without needing to be told. We sat at her kitchen table with coffee, and she asked about the holiday. I told her about the email, the porch table, the string lights, and the space heater. Carol set down her cup and asked how long I was going to let this go on. I did not answer right away. Instead, I found myself thinking about Thanksgiving of 2019, the year I sat at the folding table in the hallway. I had been looking through the glass door into the dining room when Sophie, who was 7 at the time, pulled on Diane's sleeve and asked where Grandpa was. Diane bent down and told her Grandpa liked it out there, that he was more comfortable. Sophie looked through the glass at me. I waved at her. She waved back, uncertain. I told Carol I had talked to Ryan 3 times over the years. Seriously. He apologized for Diane each time. And then things went back to normal. Carol shook her head and said Margaret would have handled it differently. She was right. Margaret would have said, "Walter, don't let anyone teach your son how to treat his father." Carol looked at me carefully and asked what I was going to do. I told her I was going to show up, same as always. She did not look satisfied with that answer, but something in my voice must have told her this time was different, because she did not push. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. It was Carol texting me. Diane had called her, and Carol wrote, "She called me, Walt, and asked me to tell you not to arrive too early. They need time to set up. She also said the Holiday Inn down the road is nice if you want to stay over." I read it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the passenger seat. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I drove up to Columbus and asked Ryan to meet me for lunch, just the 2 of us. We met at a sandwich place near his office, the kind of spot without tablecloths, where you can talk without performance. Ryan came in already apologizing. Not for anything specific yet, just with that particular expression he gets, the one that means he already knows what the conversation is about and wishes it were not happening. We ordered. He waited. I told him I needed him to hear me clearly. Sophie had asked why her mother called me the janitor. Those were her words. Ryan closed his eyes for a second and started to say Diane did not mean it that way. I stopped him. I told him I was not asking him to explain her. I was asking a different question. I asked what he wanted his children to understand about respect, because right now, they were watching, and what they were learning was that this was normal. Ryan was quiet for a long time. He turned his water glass around in his hands and finally said he would talk to her. I nodded. He called that night. I was on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky go dark over the tree line. He told me Diane said I was exaggerating. She was sorry if my feelings had been hurt. Then he paused and said she thought the seating arrangement should stay as planned because it would cause less tension. I let that sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "All right." Ryan started to say something else, but I told him I would be there Thursday and not to worry about me. I hung up and sat with the cold coffee. That was the last time I asked. I had said what needed saying. Ryan had heard it and made his choice. I understood. He was caught between 2 people he loved, but understanding something does not mean you keep accepting it. After that, I waited. Pat sent the personnel summary on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days after I asked for it. Diane Marsh Jarvis, Controller, Harmon Property Services, hired November 3 years prior. Compensation, $14 base. Direct report to CEO Marcus Brown. Current status, under consideration for interim CFO, following the planned departure of the current CFO in Q1. I read through it the way I read most business documents, once carefully, then again for what was not said. What was not said was simple. She had no idea. Her offer letter came from Harmon Property Services. Her W-2 said the same. HR correspondence, benefits enrollment, performance reviews, all of it ran through Harmon letterhead. There was no reason she would have looked past that. Most employees do not. My name was in a state business registration that nobody reads unless they are looking for it. I called Pat back and told her not to change anything on Diane's status. Leave everything as is. Pat understood and asked if there was anything else. I told her no and thanked her. I set the phone down and sat with it for a while. I could have ended all of it with one call to Marcus. A quiet conversation, a reassignment, nothing dramatic. That option was available to me, and I knew it. But that was not what I wanted. I did not want Diane to lose her job over 12 years of bad manners. That felt like an overreach, punishing her professionally for something personal, and that is not how I was raised to operate. Honestly, it was not what would fix anything. Ryan would still be my son. Sophie and Mason would still be my grandchildren. The table would still be set wrong. What I wanted was simpler. I wanted the truth to be in the room. I was not going to put it there with a speech. I was just going to stop keeping it out. The Monday before Thanksgiving, Carol called me at 8. 0 inches the morning. Her voice was tight. Diane had called her the night before. Carol had taken notes because she wanted to get it right. Diane had asked Carol to gently let me know that arriving before noon might create some stress, since they would still be setting up. She also said that if I planned to stay overnight, the Holiday Inn on Riverside was very comfortable and only 10 minutes away. Carol stopped, then told me Diane was basically telling me not to come to my own son's house. I looked out the window at the backyard. The garden had gone dormant for the season. The bird feeder needed filling. I told Carol I heard her. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I was going to fill the bird feeder, and then I was going to make a pie. Carol exhaled through her nose, the sound she makes when she is frustrated and trying not to show it. She told me she was not going to respond to Diane and that she would pretend the call had never happened. I said that was probably right. After we hung up, I called Pat to confirm the address and timing for Thursday. She said she would have everything and would be there at 2:00. Then there was a pause on her end, and she said, "I'll be there at 2:00, Mr. Jarvis." That was the first time in 11 years she had called me Mr. Jarvis instead of Walt. I had not asked her to. She had simply understood, without being told, that this was a professional visit. Sometimes the people who know you best do not need an explanation. They just show up. I left Millbrook at 10:30 Thursday morning. The apple pie was on the passenger seat, wrapped in a dish towel the way Margaret used to pack things for travel. The F-150 made its usual highway sounds, a low hum, a faint rattle from something in the bed that I had been meaning to tighten for 2 years. The sky was gray and flat. November in Ohio has a particular kind of quiet to it. Ryan's house is in a suburb east of Columbus, a brick colonial with a 2-car garage and a covered porch they had redone the previous spring. Nice neighborhood, the kind of street where everyone rakes their leaves. I pulled in at 11:15. There were already 3 cars I did not recognize in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see people moving around inside. Diane opened the door. She smiled and said it was good to see me. Then she told me the porch was all set up for Carol and me, and that the space heater was already on. She said it the way a hotel concierge says your room is ready. Smooth, practiced, closed off. I stepped inside. The house smelled like roasting turkey and something cinnamon. The dining room table was set for 12. White linens, tall candles, the good china. I counted the chairs without turning my head. 12 chairs, 14 people expected. The table had room for 2 more. Through the sliding door to the porch, I could see a folding table and 4 chairs. String lights, just like she had promised. The space heater glowing orange in the corner. I handed Diane the pie. She took it and turned toward the kitchen, saying she would put it with the others. I went out to the porch, took off my jacket, sat down, and looked out at the backyard. The clock on the microwave, visible through the kitchen window, read 11:22 a.m., 2 hours and 38 minutes. Carol and Gerald arrived just before noon. Carol came straight to the porch, found me there, and sat down without saying anything. Gerald went to find Ryan. Carol looked at the string lights. She looked at the space heater. She did not comment on either. By 1:00, the house was full. Through the glass, I could see Diane moving between the kitchen and dining room, directing her world the way she always did. Brad and Leslie were there, settled into the couch with wine. Other couples I recognized from past years had arrived too. Ryan was in the kitchen plating things. Sophie ran past the door and stopped when she saw me, pressing her hand flat against the glass. I waved. She mouthed something I could not hear. At 1:30, Diane slid the porch door open and announced that everyone was all set. She told me and Carol our food would be brought out in just a minute. Then the door slid closed again. Through the glass, I watched Brad lean over to Ryan and say something. Ryan nodded once, quickly, and looked at his hands. Then, through the cracked window above the kitchen sink, I heard Diane's voice. She said she did not want me dominating the conversation in there, and that everyone knew how it got. Leslie's answer was too low to make out. Carol stood up. She slid the door open and walked inside. She told Diane that I was Ryan's father, and that my seat was at that table. Diane turned from the counter, and her voice went warm and reasonable in the way it did when she wanted witnesses. She told Carol they had talked about this, that it was just a seating arrangement, and that the porch was perfectly comfortable. The room went quiet by degrees. Brad looked at his wine glass. Leslie studied the tablecloth. Ryan did not stand up. I stood up from the porch table, picked up my coffee cup, and walked inside. I did not rush. I came through the sliding door and stood at the edge of the dining room, where the kitchen opened into the space where everyone was gathered. 14 people. The candles were lit. The turkey was on the counter. Everything was ready. Diane saw me. Her posture shifted just slightly, like she was recalibrating. She said my name in that warm, reasonable voice and told me honestly, I would be more comfortable outside. I did not need to come in there. The room went still. Not the kind of still where people are waiting to see what happens. The kind of still where people are hoping nothing happens at all. Brad looked at the floor. Leslie turned her face toward the window. Gerald put down his fork. Across the room, Ryan sat with his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Sophie was standing in the doorway to the hallway. She was looking at me with her hands at her sides, very still for a 10-year-old. The way children go still when they understand something is happening that they are not supposed to see. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at Ryan. He did not look up. I said, "All right." I walked back out to the porch, set my coffee cup down on the folding table, put both hands on the railing, and looked out at the backyard. The brown November grass, the bare tree line, the bird feeder Carol had told me needed filling. I was not angry. Past a certain point, anger does not come anymore. What I felt was something quieter and more final. The particular clarity of a man who has waited long enough and will not be waiting anymore. The clock on the kitchen microwave read 1:52 p.m., 8 minutes. I stood on that porch for 8 minutes. And before we get to what happened next, I want to ask you something. I think you already know the feeling. Have you ever stayed quiet to protect something, only to watch that silence be mistaken for weakness? If this story is hitting close to home, I would really appreciate a like and a share. It helps more people find their way here. Now let me tell you what happened at 2:02 p.m. The doorbell rang at 2:02. I heard it through the wall, a single clean tone cutting through the low murmur of conversation inside. Then silence. Then Ryan's voice at the front door, asking if he could help. A woman's voice answered, composed and clear. It was Patricia Nguyen. She introduced herself as Mr. Jarvis's executive assistant and said he had told her he would be there. Then she asked if he was available. A beat of silence followed. Ryan repeated the words executive assistant like he was trying to make sense of them. I heard footsteps, Diane's. I recognized the pace. Then I heard her voice from somewhere near the entryway, asking who this was. Pat's tone did not change. She apologized for the interruption and explained that she needed Mr. Jarvis's signature on the Fairfield acquisition documents before close of business Monday. She said she could be quick. I came in from the porch. The front door was open. Pat stood on the threshold in a charcoal blazer, her leather portfolio under one arm, her reading glasses on a chain. She looked exactly the way she always looked on a workday, unhurried, organized, and entirely purposeful. The room had gone quiet in a different way than before. Not the tense quiet of people avoiding conflict, but the still quiet of people trying to understand what they were seeing. Brad was standing near the fireplace. He had set his wineglass down. Pat saw me and gave a small nod. She called me Mr. Jarvis. Ryan was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him since he was a boy, like something he thought he understood had just shifted under his feet. Diane was standing very still. Her eyes moved from Pat to me, then to the portfolio in Pat's hand, then back to me. I crossed the room and thanked Pat for driving up. She said of course and opened the portfolio. Pat laid the documents on the side table near the entryway, the one where Diane kept a vase of dried flowers and a framed school photo of Sophie and Mason. Brad had moved closer. I noticed it without looking directly at him. Pat said the Fairfield closing had moved to Monday morning, and that the other party's counsel wanted everything executed that night to allow time for processing. I said that was fine and picked up the pen she offered. Brad was now close enough to read the cover page. I heard him exhale through his nose, quiet and deliberate. He said my name aloud, Calvin Jarvis. Then he said Jarvis Holdings. He looked up and said his firm had bid on one of the Fairfield parcels the previous year. I looked at him and said I remembered Whitmore Legal. Good firm. Brad shook my hand firmly, the way you shake hands with someone you have underestimated. Then he turned to Diane. His voice was neutral and polite. He asked if she was at Harmon Property Services. Diane was standing near the kitchen doorway. She had not moved since I came inside. Pat consulted her folder with the practiced calm of someone who had no reason to be otherwise. She said Harmon Property Services was a subsidiary of Harmon Holdings Group, which fell under Jarvis Holdings. Then she looked toward Diane and said, Miss Marsh Jarvis, I believe you're our controller there. The room did not make a sound. I signed the documents and handed the pen back to Pat. Across the table, Carol sat with one hand pressed flat against her collarbone. Diane was looking at me. Her face carried the expression of someone who had just understood that a conversation she thought she was controlling had actually been about something else the entire time. I looked back at her. I did not smile. I did not need to. I thanked Pat. She nodded and answered, Of course, Mr. Jarvis. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Sophie appeared from the hallway, drawn by the quiet the way children always are. She looked at Pat's portfolio, then at me, then at the cover page of the document still visible on the side table. She asked if I was a boss. I crouched down to her level and told her I was just a person who worked hard, same as always. She considered that, then nodded, like it made complete sense, and went back toward the kitchen. Leslie reached over and touched Brad's arm. He was still standing near the side table, looking at Diane with an expression that was not unkind, but was not what it had been before. The polite, easy assumption Diane had handed him every year, that Ryan's dad did odd jobs and everyone knew how it was, had simply stopped being true, and they both knew it. Carol had not moved from the dining room. Gerald put his hand over hers. Ryan was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at the floor. Diane found her voice. She said my name and told me she had no idea about the company. She said she was sorry. I turned to face her. I told her I knew she did not know. I let that be enough. There was nothing to add to it. I handed the portfolio back to Pat and told her to drive carefully because snow was coming in west of 71. She said she would be fine, closed the portfolio, nodded once to the room, and wished everyone a happy Thanksgiving. The door clicked shut behind her. The turkey was going cold on the counter. The candles were still burning. And 12 years of a particular story about who I was, what I was worth, and where I belonged had just ended in a front hallway in Columbus, Ohio, without a raised voice. The guests left earlier than usual. Brad shook my hand at the door, firmly with both hands, the way people do when they want to say more than they are saying. He told me it had been an honor. Leslie said goodbye to Carol and then did not look at Diane on her way out. The others filtered out over the next 30 minutes, polite and efficient. The turkey was carved and eaten in a subdued, rearranged way. People filled their plates in the kitchen instead of sitting formally. Conversations ran shorter than normal. Sophie and Mason ate at the counter and were sent upstairs by 7:00. Diane cleared the table and went to the bedroom without dessert. The apple pie sat on the counter, uncut. Ryan and I ended up at the kitchen table after the house went quiet. Just the two of us, the way it had not been in a long time. He had his hands around a coffee mug. He did not drink from it. He asked why I had never told him. I told him I had 3 times, in real conversations, not passing mentions. Each time, he had apologized on Diane's behalf, and then everything had gone back to the way it was. He looked at his hands, the mug, and the table. He said he had let me sit outside. I told him he had let it happen more than once. That landed. I watched it land. I did not add anything to it because nothing needed to be added. Ryan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. He said he had not protected me. I told him no, he had not. He nodded slowly. This was not the place for reassurance. I had learned that much from 40 years of raising him and losing his mother. Sometimes the only honest thing you can do is let a true thing be true. He asked what happened now. I told him that depended on him. Friday morning. I was up before 6:00. The house was quiet in the way houses are when everyone inside them is awake but has not yet decided to be. I came downstairs in the dark and started the coffee. The apple pie was still on the counter. I cut 2 slices and put them on plates. Diane came in at 6:40. She was dressed, her hair pulled back, the way she looks when she is prepared for something she does not want to do. She stopped when she saw me at the kitchen table. I nodded toward the second plate and told her to sit down. She sat. Neither of us said anything until the coffee was poured. Her voice was careful when she said my name. She told me she genuinely did not know about the company, about any of it, and that she wanted me to understand that. I told her I did understand it. Then she said she needed to apologize for what had happened the day before and for a lot of things before that. I set down my cup. I looked at her directly, the way I try to look at anyone when I am about to say something that matters. I told her I was not holding the company over her. That was not what this was about. She did her job well. Marcus told me so, and I believed him. Her position was not in question. She blinked. That was not what she had expected. Then I told her I needed her to understand something different. For 12 years, she had taught my grandchildren that their grandfather did not belong at the same table as his family. Not in anger, calmly, consistently. In front of people she wanted to impress. Sophie had asked me why her mother called me the janitor. She was 10 years old. Diane looked down at her plate. I told her I would keep coming to that house. I would keep being Ryan's father and Sophie and Mason's grandfather. But from then on, when I walked in, I would sit at the main table. Not because I was her employer, but because I was their grandfather. Then I picked up my fork and said the pie was good that year, Margaret's recipe. Diane did not answer, but she picked up her fork too. Ryan drove me back to Millbrook Saturday evening. The highway was quiet, with that particular stillness that settles over Ohio after a holiday. Half the state, somewhere between where they came from and where they are going. Ryan drove the way he always does when he has something on his mind. 2 hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead, waiting for a signal that it is okay to speak. We were 20 minutes out of Columbus when he asked if I was going to let Diane go. I said no. That was not what this was. He admitted he had not been sure. I told him I knew. I watched the tree line pass in the dark and told him Diane was good at her job. What had happened between Diane and me had nothing to do with what happened at Harmon. I was not going to mix those two things. He was quiet again. Then he said he should have stood up at the table when she said what she said. I told him yes, he should have. He said he kept thinking that if he just managed it, it would eventually settle down. I told him that kind of thing never settles down. It just grows in the space you leave for it. Ryan did not argue. We drove in silence for a stretch, and it was a different kind of silence than the ones we had been having lately. Less like avoidance. More like two people sitting with something real. Finally, he said he was going to talk to Diane, really talk to her, not just smooth it over. I told him good. He said he did not know how it would go. I told him that was all right. Honest conversations usually do not come with a guaranteed outcome. That is part of what makes them honest. He pulled into my driveway and left the engine running. I got out, then stood by the truck. I thanked him for the ride. He nodded. In certain lights, he still looked like his mother. He told me he loved me. I told him I loved him too. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I drove to Columbus and sat down with Marcus Brown. Marcus was 53. Steady. The kind of man who built his career by reading situations accurately. I had hired him 7 years earlier for exactly that quality. He was waiting for me in the conference room with coffee and a notepad, which he did not open. I told him everything he needed to know. I was Calvin Jarvis, chairman of Jarvis Holdings. Harmon Property Services was a subsidiary. Marcus had been the face of the operation by design. I had always preferred it that way. But going forward, I wanted him to communicate with me directly on matters involving senior leadership and major structural decisions. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he understood. I told him Diane Marsh Jarvis would remain in her role. Her work was excellent. I had no grievance with her professionally. Marcus nodded. Then I told him the interim CFO consideration should be tabled for now. I wanted to see the Q1 books first, reassess the structure, and make that decision without rushing. He nodded again, clean and professional. He understood what I was saying and what I was not saying, which is exactly the kind of intelligence I had hired him for. Diane was not dismissed. She was not demoted. She walked into the office Monday morning, the same as she had every Monday for 3 years, with her standing desk, her corner office, and her team of 8 who respected her. But she knew the CFO path had closed, not by any memo, not by any announcement, but by the particular silence of a door that had been quietly shut. She did not ask Marcus why. I imagine she already understood. Some consequences do not need to be explained. They simply arrive, the way truth eventually does. I drove up to Columbus in the F-150 with 2 pies and a box of presents for the kids. Same as always. I parked in the same spot in the driveway. The door opened before I even got to the porch. Sophie came out at a full run, arms wide, and hit me somewhere around the ribcage. Mason followed at a slower pace, hands in his pockets, trying to look like he was too old for that kind of thing, and then hugged me anyway. Inside, the house smelled like pine and something baking. Diane was in the kitchen. She glanced over when I came through the door and said, quietly and straightforwardly, that the seat was mine. I set the pies on the counter and thanked her. That was all. No ceremony, no formal peace treaty. Just 2 people who had arrived at a different arrangement, not through warmth, but through necessity, choosing for the sake of the family around them to work with it. Carol was already at the table. She reached over and squeezed my arm when I sat down beside her. Gerald poured me a cup of coffee without asking. Ryan came out of the kitchen and sat across from me. We did not need to say much. Some things are understood through the simple act of sitting together. Sophie climbed into my lap about 20 minutes before dinner. She asked if I could tell her a story about Grandma Margaret. I looked down at her, at those clear, serious eyes. I told her I could tell her 100 of them. She settled in. The table was full. The candles were lit, and my apple pie, when Diane brought it out from the kitchen, was set right in the center where it belonged. I had not cried in 8 years. I did not cry then, either. But something in my chest loosened quietly in a way I had not expected and did not try to explain. People ask me why I did not say something sooner. It is a fair question. 12 years is a long time to absorb something, and I do not have a simple answer for it. Partly it was love. Love for Ryan. Love for those kids. The kind of love that can make you willing to carry things you should not carry. Partly, it was the way Diane made it small. Every incident on its own could be dismissed. She does not mean it that way. It is just a joke. It is just a seating arrangement. But 12 years of small things, stacked carefully, become something that is not small at all. I believed that. I still believe it. But there is a difference between not needing an audience and allowing someone to rewrite the story in the audience's presence. I let that happen for too long. The moment that changed was not the porch table. It was not the email. It was Sophie sitting on my kitchen counter, asking why her mother called me the janitor. Because Sophie was not just asking about me. She was asking about what was normal. She was taking notes. I spent 12 years protecting Ryan from conflict. The thing I failed to protect was something I could not see until my granddaughter asked the wrong question, what my grandchildren were being taught to see when they looked at me. I am not telling this story because I won something. I do not think about it that way. I am telling it because a lot of people I know, good, capable, patient people, are sitting at porch tables right now. Not always literally. Sometimes it is a meeting room, or a family dinner, or a conversation where someone has decided, without asking, that you belong on the outside. You do not have to make a scene. You do not have to announce anything. You just have to stop pretending the table was full when there was room the whole time. If you have ever sat at the wrong table, whether that was a real chair outside on a porch, or just the feeling that you were not seen the way you deserve to be seen, I want you to know your value does not require anyone's permission to exist. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where the truth finally spoke for itself? I read every one. And if you are wondering what happened with Ryan and Diane in the months after, that story is in the description. Thank you for being here.